Thank you, Liz. I want to add to the thank yous really quickly, and I'll come back at the end of the day and say even more thank yous. First, I want to say thank you to everyone who is here, because I think this is an incredibly important conversation to have. I'm really excited to see that I have some university people here, some people from the city of Dallas, residents of the neighborhoods that we're talking about, all here together to try to think about questions that I know we all think are important, but maybe we come at from different angles because of our work and the things, the pressures that we think about on a day-to-day basis. So thank you to all of you. I think we're going to have a really wonderful event today. I also want to say thank you to Paul Quinn College, and especially Dennis Coleman for hosting us. They've just done a remarkable job of making this look easy, and I appreciate their support in having us here. I also want to thank someone who's not here, and that is Sally Dillon. Sally is David Dillon's widow, and back in 2011, she entrusted the University of Texas at Arlington with David's papers, and has been a really wonderful supporter and collaborator in trying to think about the impact of her late husband's work on the city. And it is really an honor to work with her. I want to thank a couple of other people too. Willis, especially for being chair of the Dillon Center Advisory Committee, but also the other members of that committee, which include Nancy McCoy, Virginia McAllister, Kevin Sloan, and Robert Fairbanks, my colleague at the University of Texas at Arlington. That group helps very much to think about what the center should be doing and try to help establish its direction. And the conversation today will contribute to that larger conversation that we have about what we should be doing in the future. The other thing that I want to do really quickly before we get to our keynote address, which is really the highlight of the morning, I just want to spend a moment talking a little bit about why we're talking about this topic and why we're here. Today's event is an extension of the discussion that took place at the Dallas Festival of Ideas back in the spring, in which the big theme of the entire festival was issues of equity in the city. In that panel discussion, we talked a little bit about how the city got to be the way it is. And from that discussion, it became clear that something that was more focused and more granular would be a really welcome conversation to have. And that's how this conversation kind of evolved a little bit. That'd be great. And part of that conversation really began to focus on the idea that we have this incredibly rich history of African American cultural geography throughout Dallas and Fort Worth. And the slide that I'm showing you here, this is a map from 1931, and I've just put a few of the Freedman settlements that were founded in the late 19th century in the Dallas and Fort Worth area, moving all the way west from the Garden of Eden and in Fort Worth to Bear Creek and Irving, North Dallas, dropping into the 10th Street Historic District in Dallas. And I think the thing when I started plopping these things on this map, these communities are very much linked to the river and linked to the life of the river. Links to the floodplain and the fertile soils along the banks of that river. And I think this is something that once I started thinking this way, the idea that there is a footprint, there's a geography and a landscape to many of these communities that ties them together, even as they have different stories, becomes a really compelling idea to think about in Dallas and Fort Worth in particular. And the other thing, of course, is that many of these neighborhoods are gone. I think the example of North Dallas in particular, this is an aerial photograph of highway construction, which is just one of many kind of surgical removals of the African American neighborhoods in North Dallas, with Central Expressway cutting through the old neighborhoods here. And Marsha Pryor has written with great authority on the transformation of this neighborhood into Uptown, into the Arts District, and the erasure of that neighborhood from Dallas. You can have the next slide. The urban renewal and highway construction did the same thing to the 10th Street Historic District, cutting right through the center of it, and we see that happening right in the middle of the highway construction process here, cutting off what becomes the 10th Street Historic District from the rest of Oak Cliff. You can have the next slide. And then by the 1980s, there's the sense that in Dallas, that these neighborhoods are being lost, right? They're disappearing. And there's a very urgent sense that something needs to be done to protect those neighborhoods, and the creation of the 10th Street Historic District is intended to protect what is one of the most intact Freedman settlements that remains. Of course, what I'm showing you here in this photograph, a little bit of a collage here, is of course that historic district brought attention to the neighborhood, but it hasn't necessarily helped to protect it or to bring the kind of development or rejuvenation. And you see a photograph here at the top of two houses in the same site photographed a year ago. And as Lizzie McWillie will be able to talk about later today, one of the biggest challenges facing the 10th Street Historic District is demolition and vacant land, as the physical record of this neighborhood is increasingly lost. In BC Workshop, again, one of the issues that surrounds these neighborhoods is the touch of outside agencies that come in to try to support the neighborhoods in their quest for development. BC, again, Lizzie can speak to this later today, has plans to create a neighborhood resource center in the 10th Street Historic District. And then there are other kinds of outside pressures. We get the next, with the planned duck park that's intended to be near the Dallas Zoo, that comes in and creates an entirely different kind of construct and geography around that neighborhood, and that perhaps is intended to bring economic development to the neighborhood, but I think there's a discussion to be had about the balance of heritage and its impact. I think on the next slide. And very quickly as well, I think one of the neighborhoods that I know will come up today is the neighborhood in Joppy. Further south, down along the river, a different kind of geography, more agricultural, between the river and the railroad tracks, and now between two highways as well. The footprint of that neighborhood in relationship to water and the river has remained stable. Have the next slide. But here, of course, there's the touch of outside agencies as well, and Habitat for Humanity has worked extremely hard across the past decade to stabilize the neighborhood through new construction. Over the past couple of weeks, a new street and new houses were constructed in Joppy. We have the next slide. And there are pieces of that neighborhood as well. This is the old Melissa Pierce School in the Joppy neighborhood, which remains as a physical landmark of Dallas's segregated school system in the 1950s and 1960s. So lots of questions, if we have the next slide please, about the impacts here, about the move of the Byron Nelson golf tournament to the Trinity Forest Golf Club, basically directly adjacent to the neighborhood, and its potential impact on how that neighborhood will change in the future. And I give you this very, very brief little overview just to give a sense for why this conversation is important to have right now, why Andrea Roberts is such a great person to come and give us space, some new ways of thinking, new ideas about how to approach issues of heritage and development as we move further into the 21st century. I still have a hard time thinking that it's really the 21st century, but there are big questions to think about. And that's why we've invited Andrea and all of the rest of our panelists here today to try to think about these issues from many different points of view. With that, let me very quickly, just one more slide. The plan for the day, just in terms of schedule, we've got morning, we have our keynote speaker and discussion panel. We have a break for lunch. Our box lunches will arrive back where the coffee has been. There'll be an opportunity for you to either join a working group and talk through some of these issues or take a tour of the campus, which it's a really nice day, so that's tempting as well. And then we'll come back at about 1:30 and we'll convene for some reports from our working groups as well as our final discussion panel, just to keep in mind how the plan of the day will progress. With that, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. Andrea Roberts is a native Texan. She is Assistant Professor of Urban Planning and a Faculty Fellow of the Center for Heritage Conservation at Texas A&M University, and she is the founder of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project. Her scholarship makes visible the planning and placemaking history of formerly enslaved Africans in Texas and the Americas, and examines the ways those practices can address contemporary development and historic preservation challenges facing Black settlements, and frames their practices as cultural resilience and social justice practices. From 2016 to 2017, Andrea was an emerging scholar fellow at the University of Texas at Austin School of Architecture. She holds a PhD in community and regional planning with a specialization in historic preservation and the African diaspora studies from the University of Texas at Austin, an MA in governmental administration and public finance from the University of Pennsylvania, and a BA in political science from Vassar. She brings to her scholarship 12 years of experience in community and economic development for cities and counties, including the city of Houston and the city of Philadelphia. Her current work reflects her ongoing concern with African American spatial justice, overlooked planning histories, and the role of cultural agency in place preservation. She's written about social justice, intersectionality, and historic preservation for the National Trust Preservation Leadership Forum and African American Placemaking for Places Journal. Current projects include a book about African American historic preservation practice as a form of resistance, and a statewide Freedom Colony Place Inventory and Digital Humanities Initiative. And with that, please join me in welcoming Andrea Roberts.
That lady you were talking about sounds cool. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here, and great to be here at Quinn College. And I want to talk to you today about practices and possibilities. The practices and possibilities associated with grassroots place preservation in African American communities. And I say place preservation very purposefully. Place preservation as being more than about our attachment to buildings and more than about the past, but very much about the future and about people and community. Next. But before I begin, I always ground my presentations in my own past and my own connection to African American historic settlements, namely one called Riceville in Houston, Texas. That's my great-grandma, Hester Allen, in the middle, with my grandma Vi, my little sister, and myself, in front of her house in Riceville, smack dab in the middle of Houston. And it is this history that I didn't even account for in my mind as history and as significant until much later in my life. And it's this energy, this sort of stick-to-itiveness of people who stayed in their historic African communities that I carry with me in my work. And then there's also another shared energy of a shared American ancestor that I'd like us all to call on today as we think about these subject matter. Because I'm calling on her today. Next. I'm calling on Fannie Lou Haney. And she asked very tough questions about America, very tough questions about community and what we're capable of and what we can do. And most of all, next, she said for 300 years we've given them time, and I've been tired so long. Now I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, and we want a change. And I think that everyone in this room wants that sense of change, not just in the form of revitalization, but the way we think about our relationship between place and our future. Next. She said this in December 1964. That was after she spoke before the Democratic National Convention, August 1964. And in Harlem, she stood on the same stage as Malcolm X. And it's that connectedness that I also want us to make today between different factions within the African American community, different voices, different perspectives, because that's what it's going to take for African Americans to have the agency to control their future and their communities. Next. Next. So my frustration, or my sick and tiredness, very much comes out of some very concrete, real experiences. It come out of, as was mentioned before, working for the city of Houston, working with tax increment zones and seeing the work done at tax increment zones in Houston, the city of Houston and Freedmanstown, and seeing that there were residents of Freedmanstown who were much more interested in housing and people on tax increment zone committee or board who were much more interested in exponential development or development that was going to bring in young people with lots of income and displace and destroy a lot of the historic fabric. I later worked for the city of Houston's planning with their community development block grants. How do you spend money for infrastructure? And in the course of doing that, I found a lot of people more interested in how we move people away from their communities. How do we move them to opportunity? Because opportunity can't possibly be where you are now. Let's move you to opportunity. Let's integrate our neighborhoods as much as possible, which there's nothing wrong with integration. But when seen as a solution, it didn't speak to the concerns that people in historic neighborhoods in Houston were articulating. It wasn't the first thing on their mind. And so they would come to meetings, and I've held lots of meetings where I listened to people from historic neighborhoods in Houston. And so all of that informed or colored the kind of assumptions that drove me into doing the work I do today. Next. So very simply, assumptions about black communities. Number one, they're all in the inner city. They're all urban, and they always were urban, and black people aren't urban people. There's only a few special historic neighborhoods. There's very few. We count them on one hand, and we'll just keep going back to those same leaders in those same communities because they're certain, and we get our hands around them, and we know them. Memorialization. That was the past. That's very interesting. We should have lots of pride. We should be very happy that we had that wonderful past of self-sufficiency. But that's the past. And if we can put up some markers, and if we can save one example, then we've done our jobs. And the one-size-fits-all solutions. We are all looking for replicable practices that work. But we also have to recognize context and local knowledge from that context. These were all things I was encountering, and a sense of exclusionary preservation, which privileged the building over the people. I know I'm in a room of architects. I work with architects every day. But I have to say, we have to balance our conceptualization of community as being about landscape and geography and buildings and people. Next. And so that led me into thinking very deeply, while I was still working for the city of Houston, thinking very deeply about how I was going to enter this world of thinking more intellectually about, shifting people's thoughts about African American communities, what agency they have, what power they have to change their own lives, what skills they bring to the table, rather than being always the object of planning. How are African Americans planning? I studied mutual aid societies, I studied all types of organizations, and came upon communities called freedom colonies. Now, freedom colonies are known as freedom colonies because of a historian named Thad Sitton. But it's a name given to African American land-owning communities that accumulate land and come together and form community. It's a very broad conceptualization of African American, bottom-up African American community building. Next. Next. So when we talk about freedom colonies, we're talking about African American settlements founded between 1865 and 1920, very generally speaking. And we of course know this is a period of extreme terror, and while lots of African Americans did attain land through various means, between 1865 and about 1867, African Americans were not able to take advantage of the Texas Homestead Act of 1866, which means by the time that they were able to accumulate land, either through purchase, if they had managed to save any money, or through simply squatting on land, adverse possession, technically speaking. If they were able to attain land through adverse possession, they were then finding the land you described, the bottom land, right? Bottom land meaning near water sources, near mills, near railroads. And so what's amazing about freedom colonies is that they were founded starting in 1865, and by 1870 African Americans had close to about 2% of all farmland. They owned 2% of all farmland in Texas. When we reached 1910, African Americans owned 31% of all farmland in Texas. Wow, right. That's how I feel. Wow. That's very significant in a time where we know down the street in Waco in the late 1900s there were hangings in the middle of the street. We know that this was a time of extreme violence and political repression. Yet, African Americans in Texas accumulated 31% of all farmland in Texas. How did they do that? And why isn't that the case anymore? That's what began to drive. Next. And it drove me to start thinking, okay, how many still exist? These are questions you're probably thinking. How many still exist? What does it mean to say that they still exist? Where are they? And so one of the things that's important about the history book, Freedom Colonies, is that it does provide a preliminary list of settlements. But then I began researching in Texas Historical Commission, state archives, in various county histories, and found that there were significantly more. So long story short, what this is showing you, this map is depicting the concentrations of freedom colonies by county in Texas. And so we have place names by county. And so we can see that there's a concentration, as we might anticipate, on the eastern half of the state, but there are even more at the northeast half, where there is a lot of cotton farming, than there are in places like Harris County, for example. And so we're looking at a map depicting 547 place names. Again, 547 in the state of Texas. So that's a large number. So we have to think of a reasonable way that we can get our arms around understanding where they all are, mapping them all, that sort of thing. But while I was trying to figure that out next, I began to think about, well, how do we talk about how these still exist? And then I thought about, why it is that many of them still don't exist anymore. She mentioned some of the obvious reasons. We have a great migration, we have violence, we have people leaving for political asylum to go as far as California and Detroit. But for the most part, we have people going to major cities to seek economic opportunity. And they're 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours from their freedom colonies. So unlike other states or other migration patterns, if you were coming up from Mississippi to Chicago, you weren't able to go to Chicago, from Chicago to Mississippi on the weekend. It wasn't a drive. It wasn't a short drive. So we have a significantly different sort of pattern here. But we have also infrastructure projects that are bifurcating, splitting up these communities, chopping them up. We have issues of building integrity. That is, buildings that we can't preserve, or we can't necessarily say are historic anymore because of demolition by neglect or deferred maintenance, due to the fact that we, of course, have a banking system that doesn't always support lending home equity loans and things of that nature to help people maintain their homes. And we have invisibility as a result, yet a persistent invisible, or rather intangible heritage in the form of tradition, music, story, oral tradition of various kinds. And so to understand these communities, I knew to some extent I was going to have to tap into this intangible heritage. Next. Next. And I also had to think about why it is, what are the structural reasons, the structural racism that erases these communities as well. So a number of them have a status of being unincorporated, or they were annexed. This is depicting 3 different maps that show the annexation of African American settlements in Houston. And through this annexation, there was a certain erasure or swallowing of these communities, whether it was Sunnyside because you needed more space for an airport, or Pleasantville because industrial uses were expanding on the northeast side of town. So we had these sort of structural reasons why it was easy to just come along, erase, and swallow up communities. Next. And so thinking about those structural reasons, thinking about this intangible heritage and how I was going to get a hold of it, and thinking about getting my arms around this 547, I was fortunate to run into someone who said, I think there's this cool place you need to go check out in East Texas. Living in Austin at the time, still a student at University of Texas at Austin. Next. And they say, go to Schenkelville. They're having this festival. Y'all are everywhere. Schenkel descendants. And so, next. And so the Schenkelville's first annual Purple Pulp Pea Festival was in 2014. And I had the opportunity to attend, and I had a really good time. So Shankleville is about 15 miles from the Louisiana border in Texas. And the Purple Hole Pea Festival is special because it's an opportunity for people in the region to share in a food and all the culture that goes along with a food that was a staple of both black and white communities, the Purple Hole Pea. Next, so it's a wonderful festival. I had a great time. Next. And here's the thing to understand before we talk about Shankleville. How do you get to Shankleville? Again, 15 miles from the border, but you have to drive, if you're thinking about coming from Austin, you have to drive through San Jacinto County, Polk, Tyler, Jasper County, Newton County. It's a little ways. Next. And we can't deny that when we think about Jasper County next, we are talking about a very significantly traumatic history in not only Texas, but the history of the United States. That is the James Byrd dragging death. So when you're myself and you say, you know, hey Mom, I'll be in Jasper area for the weekend. I'm just gonna drive by myself to Jasper. They didn't think it was a good idea for some reason. And this is the reason. And so African Americans are in the area are giggling a little bit because this is a common thing that we tell ourselves. Don't go to those areas. Those are the areas we fled from. There can't be anything good there that has to do with our freedom, our heritage, our self-sufficiency, our self-determination. But I found just the opposite. Not that this was not true by any means, but I found that the public history had so been dominated by this that it had obscured the story of places like Shankleville. Next. Next. So this is the community core of Shankleville, Texas. And we see the Mother Church, Zion CME Church. And in the far right corner, it's difficult to see, behind the marker is the Odom Homestead. And beyond the Odom Homestead is a very thickly concentrated forest. Very hard to get through, way in the back there. But this is a community core, in which you don't see that's also significant are cemeteries over to the right. Next. When you go through that thick grove in the back, you come upon this spring down here that's capped off there at the time. And this is where a very significant foundational story is told about Shankleville. It's their origin story. And the story is this, that there were two enslaved Africans in Mississippi, Jim and Winnie. And Winnie had 3 children. And Winnie was sold away to a master in Texas, her and her children. And Jim loved Winnie so much that he swam 3 great rivers. And he ran away and he hid in dark of night until he found Winnie again. And he found Winnie here at this spring, where Winnie hid him and his food in the cold spring. And sure enough, you put your hand in the water and it's freezing cold. And so this spot is where they come back to recount this story. Next. Next. But the story is not just a wonderful fairy tale. I got less interested in whether or not I needed to go about proving that this story was true or not, and more about how did these people use that story? What was the utility of that story that kept people coming back? It's the middle of the woods. There's maybe 20 households that live there full time. So what's the big deal about a story? Well, the story, again, draws people back for annual events like the homecoming. How many of you have attended homecomings? Homecoming celebrations? Yes, okay. So homecoming celebrations are a Texas thing, but with African Americans, they're very much tied to the Great Migration. That is, how is it that they continued to keep African Americans coming back to these communities after they left? And so most of the homecomings for African Americans that I documented sprang up from the mid-1930s up through the 50s, along with the Great Migration. And so I attended homecomings. And when I went to this homecoming, I noted that all of these different individuals in front of the offering basket, behind the offering basket, were associated with settlements in the area. So it was a network. And so during the homecoming, we would have individuals get up and tell a story of their settlement. They would say, Huff Creek Settlement, who's here? And maybe only one person would still be able to get up. And maybe they lived here in Dallas or in Beaumont. But they came every year to this homecoming to reawaken or make visible their freedom colony. Next. Next. And this story is also, again, it's recounted at that spring, which is also part of a reunion celebration that happens in cooperation with the Odom family reunion every 2 years. And that story is actually also part of, or partly referenced in the National Register of Historic Places application. So by 2012, they had managed to finally start getting this on the register. So it's one of 7 homesteads in the state of Texas among hundreds of homesteads that are African American homesteads on the National Register of Historic Places associated with Addie L. and A.T. Odom. Next. Next. And so this is all part of cultural continuity of place, attachment to place, because the last thing that an 18-year-old wants to do is go out in the middle of these Texas woods, right? It's hot, there are bugs, it's not necessarily fun, there's not great internet access. So how do you get them to come back? I mean, this is true, right? And if these communities are to survive, you have to think of creative ways to sustain attachment. And the way that they sustain attachment is through the development of a scholarship competition, where they are to talk about the values associated with Jim and Winnie Schenkel through speeches, which they then are awarded scholarships for. So they'll make you come back. A scholarship will make you come back. And so they have developed that, and they also involve the youth in the rehabbing of the Odom homestead. And the Odoms draw their lineage directly back to Jim and Winnie Schenkel. So we have this continuity, and we have this continuity and these traditional practices that are not just about the Odom family, but the larger region. Next. So then that made me think how I would structure the rest of my study, and I very much structured the study rooted in these practices. How much time do we have? Okay. Next. Next. So, not that far. That's okay. So what we did, or what I did in developing this project is I decided a few things. I said to myself, well, I need to think about how I develop relationship in this community. I need to think about how I learn about what drives this community, what these stories really mean, and whether or not other communities have these stories and use them in similar ways. Because the cheapest thing you have, right? You may not have an architect, you may not have a landscape architect, you may not have all this expertise, but people have stories. So I decided to work with, or I was invited to work with Laretha Clay on the next year's Freedom Colony Symposium at the Purple Hole Pea Festival. And I had a lot of meetings, or attended a lot of meetings, where I would work with local people to think about how we would structure this symposium at the festival, which would be held in Shankleville again. Next. So we had what I call the Texas, it's a Texas Freedom Colony Symposium, but we had a bit of a testimony service. We were in a church, and so I wanted people to give voice to their stories. That is, individuals who represented different freedom colonies, whether they be in the immediate area or even in Houston, Texas. We have Tanya DeBose there from Independence Heights, a once incorporated community in the middle of Houston. We have individuals there from Pleasant Hill, which is right down the road from Shankleville. And we had not just extraction of information, but we had Texas Historical Commission staff, we had foundation representatives, and we had information about markers and other resources, so that it wasn't just a taking of information, but it was an inviting of residents to think about how they might use these resources. Next. And I ate a lot of good food, I heard a lot of good music, I went to a lot of homecomings, and I listened a lot, and I recorded a lot. And during the course of these, I collected a number of homecoming programs and a lot of other ephemera, and through snowball sampling found a lot of other people that I spent a lot of time with, that I stayed on their homesteads with. So these homecomings were a real opening. And in my field of planning, people don't necessarily think about spending lots of time with people to hang out at their homecomings. So, next. Went on a lot of tours, did a lot of cognitive mapping, which is just simply, I think we started doing some of this table right here, where you take out a pen and you ask people to kind of recall their pathways and where they walked, and did walking tours, and look at people's collections that they didn't think much of that were in plastic baggies. Programs, as I said before, funeral programs, all of those sorts of things that give you a real way of mapping out the breadth and width of a community, even though there may not be many people left. Next. So what did I learn from all this? What's the point of all that? Next. We have to redefine and reframe freedom colonies, black settlements. We have to get more expansive and more inclusive about our thinking about African American communities. And so what this whole elaborate chart comes down to is that freedom did not start in 1865. Freedman's towns or African American historic communities did not end after Reconstruction. And that we have to develop and reframe these definitions in ways that work first for African Americans. And so that means including pre-emancipation communities. I can't tell you how many people talked about being on the borderlands of former plantations and developing their own community, even before being emancipated. Or like the story I just told you of Jim and Winnie Shangle. Some people would say, well, it was founded when people attained land, and very much so people attribute the origins to Jim and Winnie. Maroon communities, as I said, on the plantation borderlands, and of course, Freedman's towns, which I consider a first wave. So if we look at 1865 to 1877, the technical end of Reconstruction, that would be the first wave of Freedman towns in both urban enclaves and fringe communities and somewhat rural communities. We have black settlements and quarters in the second wave. That would be anywhere from the late 1890s all the way to 1920. And then we have a new wave of black suburbs, which are understudied, that we need to start considering. And as more and more architects here become passionately interested about, and you're going to hear this more and more, those of you who are architects, post-World War II suburbs, mid-century mod. When you hear those words, and if people say that walking through your African American neighborhood, it's for a reason. So understand that the black suburbs are historically significant. Next. And then we have to challenge some formal planning assumptions about place. Formal planning, that is official urban planning, we think about place, you have to have definite boundaries, and you have to have a concentration of people that are there full time. Freedom colonies, they engage in place preservation in ways that's not always, it's not always about stable boundaries, and it's often ephemeral and momentary. Next. And attachment. When we think about place attachment, it's where you've lived the longest and how long you've had tenure there, how long you've owned property consistently. With Freedom Colony, it's what I call diasporic attachment, because a lot of African Americans live here full-time here in Dallas, or they live in Houston, or they live in Beaumont. And when you ask them where home is, even though they may have never in their lives lived full-time in one of these settlements, they call it home. They still have their family's homesteads there. They still go back there periodically, and they're retiring there. And so a big part of my book is talking with baby boomers who are returning to these communities. And just to give you how significant is this? Jasper County in 2010 saw the first uptick in African American population that it's seen in decades in 2010. So this is tangible. Next. So So the other thing, another way that we challenge formal planning, well, what is planning? We have a certain definition of what planning is. It's people who work downtown in offices and look and, you know, issue permits. But I found planning was basically in 3 categories. That is, anything that contributed to preserving community and preserving place. Cultural workers, that is the people who hold these stories and share these stories about place. Kin keepers. Kin keepers, it's a terminology in sociology, and it's those people who have the family Bible. Those people who know where to find everyone in the cemetery. Those people who know where the settlements were, even though you don't see the same concentration of people there anymore. And community and asset builders, which we're probably most preoccupied with, rightly so, here in Dallas, as we think about people's connection to their assets and continuing to retain control of their assets through homestead preservation, cemetery stewardship, and adaptive reuse and reclaiming. And I'll give you an example of that next. So what we're looking at here next are 3 pictures that don't look like they go together, but they all tie to the same story and the same people in the same place. So when I listened to stories, I used the method of what I learned in Schenkelville, and when I went to a place called Dixie, I ran into some gentlemen who had reclaimed their segregation era school, which is that picture in the middle. And it was down the street from their cemetery, which oddly has the slave master associated with the plantation nearby in the middle of this African American cemetery. Smack dab in the middle. And the oldest church built this side of the Mississippi was built here in 1850 by a former, while still enslaved, Joshua Seal. Joshua Seal and his master, Joshua Seal, and the slave was actually allowed to build this church. Okay. So that would be one version of the foundational story. That is the foundational story. But the African American men in this associated with the settlement, who all live in Houston now, decided that their story was going to pull more from that school and more from the other Seal that you may know that has roots here. And that would be Bobby Seal, who, though he grew up in Oakland, California, has extensive roots in this area of Jasper County. Next. And so these gentlemen up here decided, we're going to reclaim that space. And it was a reclaiming, not just a purchase. We're going to reclaim that space. It was used as alternatively a VFW hall and also a place where supposedly the Klan had decided to meet every now and then. They pooled their money, they purchased it, and they turned it into a new community center. They repurposed it and remixed their foundational story to address their current needs and their current priorities. Next. So where are we now? I went to a lot of settlements, I recorded a lot of stories, and I returned back to my original concern, which is my project now, my focus now is how do we identify, see, map, protect all of these places that still matter to us. Next. And I talk about this as Sankofa planning because it's about going back and getting. It's a term that means go back and get. Go back and get our heritage and our places. So when I started my own study, this is what I thought. This is what I knew of how many settlements were in these 2 counties. These 12, which is a lot, right? It's still a substantial number. But after the interviews, the archival work, walking around with people, next. This is how many settlements are there. And this terminology down here, black pockets, those are places where people told me there are black pockets there. So rather than me deciding to change their language, I adopted their language. Women would say, there's a black pocket in Best Name. I said, okay. And so then when I took these photos or found these maps, we geocoded, which means we found out the location associated with the map, with the location so that we could pinpoint all of these places. So how many more are there everywhere? And if we keep thinking about our footprint as African Americans, as where the census says there's a concentration of us still living on a map, then we're not nearly understanding the footprint of African American people in the state of Texas at all. Next. Next. And so that's why I'm working on an atlas, which is to be an interactive platform, a digital heritage platform. Interactive mapping tool. Next. And the GI, what we want to do is hold all the GIS locations of the known and the unknown places. We also want this to be used as a preservation project review tool. As we have continued growth in Texas, as we lose rural land at a rate that surpasses most other states in the country, as we grow and build more infrastructure, more freeways, we will continue to threaten, build on top of African American communities. And one of the things that we are legally bound to do, people who build or who are government representatives, are to consult with, locate, find, and mitigate harm. And that is one of the primary intentions of this tool, to mitigate that harm by making these places visible, and also to determine possible eligibility of properties there that need to be protected. And this will, of course, take comparative and ethnographic research, continued research, but I'm working with two students right now who are finding all the known information before we go out and do the rest of the ethnographic field research. We'll continue to have a lot of participatory data collection. I'll need partners in communities across the state to make that happen. And I'm also working with the Institute of Texan Cultures, where we are planning a possible mobile exhibit of artifacts associated with these communities so that we continue to grow the database. Next. And you mentioned the book, Never Sell the Land. And it's inspired by people like Richard Johnson, who says, because I think that in 1893, he'd just come out of slavery. He's talking about his great-grandfather. And the legacy began, the heritage began. That's what drives me. I have one kid and I instruct her, whatever you do, don't ever sell the land. And people say this all the time, but what was significant and what I want to feature in the book is not only people who keep it, but then they figured out what to do with it. A lot of people keep it, but they don't know what to do with it. And so there's a number of creative strategies that I want to foreground in this book that address that. Next. So go back and get it. Join the project. Next. Get involved. Next. I really am excited about being at Texas A&M and starting the next phase of what I hope is a statewide project that involves every institution, HBCU, public, private, in this endeavor to grow this database that's not only a heritage preservation tool, but something that can really help us protect and connect African Americans and their places together. Thank you.